The year is 1876. The sun over West Texas is a hammer, beating the high plains into a cracked red anvil. In the heart of this unforgiving landscape lay the town of Dust Creek, a place that felt less built and more like it had simply surrendered to the grit that gave it its name. It was a handful of clapboard buildings huddled together against the vast emptiness, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The wind, a constant, restless spirit, carried the scent of dry earth, horse sweat, and the faint, bitter tang of loneliness. This was a land that valued strength above all else, where a man's worth was measured by the speed of his draw and the size of his herd, and a woman's by her piety and her ability to bear sons. It was a place with little room for softness and no tolerance for what it deemed broken. Abigail Hartman knew she was broken. The town of Dust Creek reminded her every day. At 26, she wore the story of a childhood fire not in her memory, but on her face. A web of scars pulled the skin tight across her left cheek and down her neck, a permanent, puckered testament to a tragedy that had defined her existence. The people of Dust Creek did not see a survivor. They saw a specter. They called her Scarred Abby. The name was a stone thrown from every corner, a constant, casual cruelty. The whispers followed her like her own shadow when she made her weekly trip to the general store for flour and salt. The women would pull their children closer, as if her misfortune were a contagion. The men would either look away, their faces stiff with discomfort, or stare with a morbid curiosity that was somehow worse. Sometimes, the bolder children, fueled by the thoughtless prejudice of their parents, would fling pebbles in her direction from a safe distance, their taunts lost to the same wind that whipped sand into her eyes. She had learned long ago not to react. She would lower her head, pulling the brim of her worn hat down, and keep walking. Her world had shrunk to the small plot of land she owned at the edge of town, a place consisting of a modest cabin, a corral, and a sturdy barn. She made her living boarding horses for the cowboys and drovers passing through, a solitary life that suited her. Her hands, calloused and capable, were more comfortable with the feel of a currycomb or leather reins than they ever could be with the touch of another person. Her only true companion was Scout, a pinto gelding with one brown eye and one blue. The horse was a mirror of her own patched-together existence, and he met her scarred face with nothing but the soft, unquestioning warmth of his breath. She would spend hours talking to him, her voice low and steady, sharing thoughts she would never dare speak to a human soul. He was her confidant, her family, and the one creature in the world who saw past the ruin of her skin to the person beneath. Her days were a rhythm of hard work. Before the sun had even begun to pale the eastern sky, she was up, hauling water from the well, portioning out oats, and mucking out the stalls. The physical labor was a blessing. It left her too tired at the end of the day to dwell on the ache in her heart. She was strong, her body honed by years of solitude and self-reliance. She could hoist a 50-pound sack of feed with an ease that would surprise most men. And she knew the subtle signs of a horse's temperament better than most people knew their own kin. This quiet competence was her armor, the one thing the town could not mock or take away from her. One sweltering afternoon, as she was repairing a loose board on the corral fence, a rider approached. He was not one of the usual dusty drovers on a half-starved nag. This man sat atop a magnificent black stallion that moved with a liquid power, its coat gleaming like polished jet even under a layer of trail dust. The man himself was as formidable as his mount. He was tall in the saddle, with broad shoulders that filled out his dark coat. His face, shadowed by the brim of a black Stetson, was hard and angular, carved from the same unforgiving landscape that surrounded them. His eyes, when he finally drew close enough for her to see them, were the color of a stormy sky, and they missed nothing. This was Cole Travers. Even in her isolation, Abigail knew the name. Everyone in this part of Texas knew it. Travers was a cattle baron, the owner of the sprawling T-Cross Ranch, the largest and most prosperous operation for 100 miles in any direction. He was a man of immense wealth and power, but he was also a man wrapped in his own solitude. Legend had it he had once been different. before a stagecoach robbery years ago had stolen his wife from him. Since then, he had become a creature of silence and work, a cold, remote figure who rarely came into town and spoke even less when he did. He reined his horse to a halt just outside the corral. "You board horses," he said. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. His voice was a low baritone, rough like granite. Abigail straightened up, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, a gesture that unconsciously drew attention to the unblemished side of her face. "I do," she replied, her own voice quiet but clear. $1 a week, includes feed and water." Cole Travers dismounted in one fluid motion. His eyes swept over her small operation, taking in the neat stack of hay, the clean water trough, the sturdy build of the barn. They lingered on the fence she was mending, noting the solid, practical nature of her work. Then his gaze fell upon her, and for a long moment, he simply looked. Abigail felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, the shameful instinct to turn away, to hide the side of her face that marked her as an outcast. But something in his stare stopped her. It was not pity. It was not disgust. It was a cool, detached assessment, the way a man might judge the quality of horseflesh or the lay of the land. He was simply seeing what was there. Forcing herself to meet his gaze, she held her ground. She would not cower on her own property, after an eternity that was likely only a few seconds. He gave a curt nod. "I'll be in the area for a few weeks. Need a place for my stallion." "He's particular." "All horses are particular," Abigail said, her voice betraying a hint of the pride she took in her work. "I'll see he's cared for." Without another word, he untied a leather satchel from his saddle and handed her $4 silver. The coins were cool and heavy in her palm. He then passed her the reins. "His name is Diablo," he said, and for the first time, a flicker of something that might have been a warning entered his tone. As she took the reins, Diablo tossed his head and let out a nervous snort, his powerful body tense. Abigail did not pull or fight him. Instead, she began to speak in a low, soothing murmur, the same voice she used with Scout. She reached out a hand, not to his head, but to his powerful neck, and began to stroke him with a firm, confident touch. The great horse quieted, his ears twitching as he listened to her soft words, his muscles slowly uncoiling under her knowing hand. Cole Travers watched the entire exchange without moving. He saw the way she handled the volatile animal, the fearless calm in her demeanor. He saw the strength in her slim frame as she led the stallion toward the barn. He saw the resilience that was as plain as the scars on her face. For a man who lived in a world governed by the brutal laws of survival, a world where weakness was an invitation to disaster, it was a sight that registered with unexpected force. He did not smile. His expression remained as impassive as stone. But as he turned to walk toward the town saloon, a seed of curiosity had been planted in the barren ground of his soul. The air in the Dust Creek saloon was thick and stagnant, a foul cocktail of cheap whiskey, sweat, and unlit cigars. It was the town's beating heart, a place where deals were made, reputations were shattered, and the pervasive loneliness of the frontier was kept at bay for a few hours with a bottle and a deck of cards. Cole took a table in the corner, a position that allowed him to watch the room without being a part of it. He nursed his drink, his silence a wall that no one dared to breach. The conversation around him was the usual fare, the price of cattle, the lack of rain, a rumor of trouble with a local tribe. But eventually, as the liquor flowed more freely, the talk turned to town gossip. A ranch hand named Jed, his face flushed with drink, leaned back in his chair and laughed. "Saw the Baron himself leaving his prize stallion with Scarred Abbey," he announced to his companions, his voice loud enough to carry through the room. "Suppose even a horse like that ain't too proud to be cared for by a monster." A chorus of snickers followed. Another man, a blacksmith with arms like tree trunks, chimed in. "Have to wonder what he sees in her. Maybe he keeps his eyes closed." The cruel laughter filled the small room. Outside, Abigail was walking home from the mercantile, her small bag of supplies held tight in her arms. She had needed thread and had timed her trip for dusk, hoping to avoid the worst of the town's stares. As she passed the saloon, the bat-wing doors swung open, pushed by a man stumbling out into the street. For a brief, horrible moment, the wave of noise and mocking laughter washed over her. Monster. The word struck her with the physical force of a blow. Her steps faltered. Her knuckles turned white where she gripped the bag. Her gaze dropped to the dusty boards of the walkway, her entire body rigid with a familiar, suffocating shame. She wanted to run, to disappear into the gathering twilight, but her feet felt as though they were nailed to the spot. From his corner table, Cole Travers saw it all. He saw her walking by just as Jed's ugly words filled the air. He saw her freeze, the way her shoulders slumped as if under a physical weight. He saw the defiant lift of her chin a moment later, the way she forced herself to take another step, and then another, her pace quickening as she fled the sound. She did not look back. She did not cry. She simply endured and vanished into the shadows. Cole's hand tightened around his glass. He did not look at Jed or the other men. His face remained an unreadable mask of cold indifference, but his stormy eyes were fixed on the empty doorway through which she had disappeared, and the spark of simple curiosity he had felt earlier now flickered with something deeper, something more complex. It was the quiet, dangerous interest of a man who had just witnessed a rare and profound form of courage. The wind changed 3 nights later. It was a subtle shift at first, a sigh from the south that carried a metallic taste and the scent of distant, parched earth. Abigail felt it on her skin as she made her final rounds, checking on the horses. The air grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy that made the animals restless in their stalls. Even Diablo, Cole Travers's formidable stallion, paced his enclosure, his powerful muscles twitching. By the time she had barred the barn door and retreated to her cabin, the sigh had become a mournful moan, and the first grains of sand were beginning to whisper against the window pane. Sandstorms on the high plains were not like rain or snow. They were living things, malevolent spirits of dust and fury that rose from the flatlands to swallow the sky. This one came on fast, within an hour. The world outside Abigail's cabin was a roaring, churning chaos of brown. The sun was gone, erased. The air was so thick with grit you could taste it, a fine silt that worked its way through every crack and crevice, coating the floor, the table, her eyelashes. The cabin groaned under the assault, the timbers creaking as if the structure might be torn from its very foundations and scattered across the prairie. In the midst of the gale's howl, she heard another sound. It was faint, almost lost in the din, but it was sharp with a terror that cut through the storm's impersonal rage, a calf bawling for its mother. She waited, listening, hoping it was just the wind playing tricks on her ears. But there it was again, a high-pitched, desperate cry. Some poor creature, separated from the herd, lost in the blinding maelstrom. Every instinct for self-preservation told her to stay inside, to bolt the door and wait for the storm to blow itself out. To go out in that was to risk getting lost 10 feet from your own door, to risk breathing in so much dust your lungs gave out. It was madness. She pulled on her heavy coat and wrapped a thick cloth around the lower half of her face, tying a rope to the sturdy post of her porch. She clutched the other end and stepped out into the gale. The force of the wind nearly knocked her off her feet. It was like wading into a physical wall, a solid moving thing that clawed at her clothes and stung her eyes. The world was a suffocating vortex of sand, guided only by the desperate cries and the rope in her hand. She moved slowly, leaning into the wind. She found the calf huddled against a small rise, shivering, its eyes wide with fright. It was a young thing, no more than a few weeks old, its coat matted with dust. As she tried to coax it to its feet, another shape materialized out of the swirling gloom, a figure so large and dark it seemed a part of the storm itself. It was Cole Travers on his horse, or rather, what she assumed was his horse. She could barely make out the shape of the man. His form bent against the wind, his hat pulled low. He swung down from the saddle, his voice a low shout that was nearly ripped away by the wind. "What in God's name are you doing out here?" "A calf! It was lost!" she yelled back, her own voice thin against the roar. He needed no more explanation. He grabbed the small rope she had managed to get around the calf's neck and gave a sharp tug. Together, they fought their way back towards the faint yellow light of her cabin. The calf, panicked and weak, stumbled and fell. As Cole bent to hoist it up, the animal kicked out blindly. Its hoof caught him on the forearm, not with great force, but enough to make him grunt and lose his footing on the shifting ground. He fell to one knee, the calf collapsing in a heap beside him. With a curse, he rose, half dragging and half carrying the animal the final few feet to the relative safety of Abigail's porch. They bundled the calf into her small barn, placing it in an empty stall with fresh water and a bit of hay. It immediately collapsed into the straw, exhausted. Only then, in the sudden deafening quiet of the barn, did Abigail see the dark stain spreading on Cole's sleeve. "You are hurt," she said, her voice raspy from the dust. "It is nothing," he grumbled, but when he moved his arm, a sharp intake of breath betrayed him. "Let me see." She did not wait for his permission. She reached out and gently pushed the torn fabric of his sleeve aside. A long, ugly gash ran along his forearm, shallow but bleeding freely where the calf's hoof had scraped it raw against a stone. "That needs cleaning. The dust will cause an infection." She led him into the cabin, the storm still raging outside, making the small room feel like the last safe place on earth. She lit another oil lamp, and the small space filled with a warm, flickering glow. He sat heavily in the single chair she owned while she fetched a basin of water and a clean cloth from a chest. Her hands were steady as she worked, her movements efficient and sure. She washed the wound with a quiet focus, her touch surprisingly gentle. Cole sat rigid, his body tense, watching her. He was accustomed to a world of rough men and rougher circumstances. This quiet, careful tending was something he had not experienced in a very long time. The lamplight fell across her face as she bent over her task, illuminating the intricate map of her scars. But for the first time, he found he was not looking at the scars. He was watching the concentration in her eyes, the determined set of her mouth. He saw the intelligence in her hands as she expertly wrapped a clean bandage around his arm. When she finished, she looked up, and their eyes met. The silence in the cabin was suddenly profound, broken only by the shriek of the wind outside. It was the first time they had truly been alone together, the first time they had shared a space that was not a business transaction. The air was thick with unspoken things. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "You helped me with the calf," she replied, her gaze dropping to the floor. She felt clumsy, awkward, unsure of what to say to this powerful, quiet man who now sat at her table. In her home, "You would have managed it alone," he stated, a note of respect in his voice. "You should not have gone out. It was too dangerous." "I could not leave it to die," she said simply, as if there had been no other choice. He looked around the small, tidy cabin. It was sparse, furnished with only the necessities, but it was meticulously clean. A single shelf held a half-dozen books, their spines worn with use. It was a home built for one, a fortress of solitude. He realized that in all the town's gossip and cruel speculation, no one had ever wondered about the person who lived inside the scarred skin. They had created a monster in their minds and never bothered to look for the woman. He saw her now, and she was nothing like they imagined. He saw a quiet strength that dwarfed the loud bravado of the men in the saloon. He saw a gentle heart that would risk her own life for a lost animal. The storm howled for hours, making it impossible for him to leave. They did not speak much. Words were not easy for either of them, but in the shared silence, something shifted. He asked her about the books on her shelf, and she spoke hesitantly about stories of places she would never see. She offered him coffee, and he accepted. As she moved about the small room, he watched her, noticing the grace in her worn, work-hardened hands, the quiet dignity in her posture. He was seeing, with a clarity that startled him, the woman the town had rendered invisible. Well after midnight, the wind began to subside. The roaring gale faded to a whisper, and a heavy silence fell over the plains. The storm had passed. Cole stood, his tall frame seeming to fill the small cabin. "I should go," he said. "The town will be stirring soon." She simply nodded, unable to meet his eyes again. She opened the door for him. The air outside was cold and clean, the dust settled by a film of moisture. The stars were brilliant in the freshly washed sky. He paused on the porch. "Abigail," he said, using her given name for the first time. She looked up, startled. "Be careful?" He gave her a curt nod, and then he was gone, melting into the pre-dawn darkness. His horse, however, remained in her barn. By the time the sun rose, the news had already begun to snake its way through Dust Creek, carried by the first man to notice the T-Cross Ranch's prize stallion in Scarred Abbey's barn. The rumor was born in whispers and grew into a wildfire of speculation. By mid-morning, the entire town was buzzing with it. Baron Cole Travers had spent the night at Abigail Hartman's place. Lydia Vane heard the news while purchasing lace at the general store. Lydia was a widow, a woman whose beauty was as sharp and polished as a dueling pistol. She had set her sights on Cole Travers and his vast fortune with a single-minded determination, viewing him not as a man, but as a prize to be won. The news about Abigail struck her as a personal affront, an absurdity that was both insulting and infuriating. "Can you imagine," she said to the small circle of women who always gathered around her, her voice a delicate blend of amusement and disdain, "that poor, lonely man. That scarred creature must have trapped him there with the storm. I imagine she saw her chance and took it. One can hardly blame her. I suppose it must be a desperate thing to be so unfortunate." The other women tittered, their expressions a mixture of pity for the Baron and disgust for Abigail. The story grew with each telling. Abigail had bewitched him. She had used some kind of prairie magic. She was a shameless woman, using her misfortune to prey on a grieving man's decency. When Abigail made her necessary trip into town for supplies later that day, the atmosphere was different. The whispers were louder, the stares more pointed and filled with a new, salacious kind of contempt. She felt their eyes on her like a physical touch, crawling over her skin. She saw Lydia Vane standing with her friends, saw the cruel, triumphant smile that touched the woman's perfect lips. The shame was a hot, choking thing in her throat. This was worse than being a monster. Now she was a joke, a creature of pity and sordid speculation. She fled back to her cabin, her heart pounding with a familiar, hopeless ache. This was a stain she could not wash away. They had taken her quiet, solitary life and twisted it into something ugly and cheap. She could not stay. She could not endure this new, more vicious chapter of their cruelty. With trembling hands, she began to pack a small cloth sack with her few belongings, her books, a spare dress. She would leave. She would sell the land for whatever she could get and just disappear. She would find another place where no one knew her name or the story of her face. She was tying the sack closed when a shadow fell across the doorway. Cole Travers stood there, his face as grim as a thunderhead. He took in the scene at a glance, the bag in her hands, the desolate look in her eyes. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low and hard. "I am leaving," she whispered, not looking at him. "I cannot stay here." "Because of the gossip." He said it was not a question. She finally looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears of pure misery. "They are saying they believe." She could not finish. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I know what they are saying, and I know what happened. We were two people who took shelter from a storm." He took a step closer. "You cannot run every time ignorant people open their mouths." You do not understand, she choked out, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her unscarred cheek. For you, it is just talk. For me, it is all I am. It is all they ever see. He stopped in front of her, his presence immense in the small room. He looked down at her, and his stormy eyes were not cold, but filled with a fierce intensity. Then let them look, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Do not let their blindness dictate your life. Abigail, people do not fear your face. People only fear what they do not understand, and they have never taken the time to understand you. The word struck her with a force greater than any storm. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever looked past her scars to defend her character, her very being. They pitied her or they scorned her, but no one had ever simply stood with her, the dam of a lifetime of pain, of solitude, of silent endurance, finally broke. A sob tore from her throat, raw and ragged. The tears came then, a flood she was powerless to stop. She wept for the lonely child she had been, for the woman she was, for the crushing weight of a judgment she had done nothing to deserve. And through it all, Cole Travers did not move. He did not touch her. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply stood there, a silent, unmovable witness to her grief, his gaze never wavering. In that moment, by doing nothing, he gave her everything. He gave her the dignity of her sorrow, and deep within Abigail's wounded heart, beneath the ashes of her old life, a tiny, fragile seed of something she had never dared to even dream of, a feeling as terrifying as it was beautiful, began to take root. Abigail did not leave. She unpacked her small sack and put her books back on the shelf, her movements slow and deliberate. Cole Travers's words echoed in the quiet cabin, a bulwark against the tide of shame that had threatened to sweep her away. People only fear what they do not understand. For the first time, the phrase did not sound like an excuse for cruelty, but a challenge she was no longer willing to decline. The next morning, Cole returned. He did not mention her tears or her decision to flee. He simply stood in her doorway, the rising sun at his back, and made her an offer that changed the course of her life. My foreman who ran the stables quit last week, he said, his tone all business. The men are good with cattle, but clumsy with horses. I need someone who knows what they are doing. The job is yours if you want it. There is a small cabin that comes with it. It pays $20 a month. $20 a month was a fortune, more money than she had ever dreamed of earning. But it was not the money that made her heart beat faster. It was the offer itself, a real job, a position of trust and responsibility at the largest ranch in the territory. He was not offering charity. He was offering respect, a commodity far more precious to her than gold. He had seen her skill, and he valued it. Her decision to accept was immediate, but it brought with it a ghost. As she prepared for the move, packing her few possessions into a small wagon Cole had sent for her, her mind drifted back through the years, back to a night of smoke and fire in 1862. She had been a girl of 12, and her world had been a small farmstead filled with the scent of her mother's baking and the sound of her father's laughter. And there had been Martha, her little sister, only 6 years old, with hair the color of corn silk and a smile that could charm the bees from the flowers. The fire had come in the dead of night, a stray ember from the hearth catching on a dry floorboard. It moved with the speed and hunger of a wolf. Her parents had perished in the initial confusion, trapped in their room. Abigail had woken to a wall of heat and the terrifying roar. Her only thought had been Martha. She had found her sister huddled in a corner, paralyzed with fear. Abigail had wrapped her in a wet blanket and carried her, a small, precious weight, through a gauntlet of falling, burning timbers. A collapsing beam had struck her as she reached the door, the flaming wood searing into her face and neck as she shielded her sister with her own body. She had saved Martha. But the girl who emerged from the inferno was not the same one who had gone in. The flames had taken her face and, in doing so, had stolen her future. Her sister now lived in Dust Creek. Martha was the wife of the town sheriff, a man named Elias Thorne. She was a respected woman, a pillar of the church, a mother to 2 healthy children, and she was deeply, profoundly ashamed of the sister who had saved her life. On the rare occasions their paths crossed in town, Martha would offer a tight, pained smile and a curt nod before finding an urgent reason to be elsewhere. She never invited Abigail to her home. She never spoke of their shared past. To Martha, Abigail was not a hero. She was a horrifying, living reminder of a tragedy best forgotten, a public embarrassment that complicated her carefully constructed life. The scars on Abigail's face were a brand of shame for them both. Cole's offer was a chance to leave that ghost behind, or at least to put some distance between them. She arrived at the T-Cross Ranch 2 days later. It was less a ranch and more a small, self-sufficient kingdom carved out of the wilderness. A large, formidable ranch house stood at its center, surrounded by a sprawling complex of barns, bunkhouses, and corrals. The air hummed with activity. The shouts of men, the lowing of cattle, and the constant ringing of the blacksmith's hammer. It was a world of men, and they stopped to stare as she drove her small wagon toward the stables. Their face held a mixture of disbelief and open curiosity. Cole met her and showed her to the small, sturdy cabin that would be her home. It was twice the size of her old place, with a proper iron stove and a small porch. He then walked her to the stables, a massive structure that housed dozens of horses. "They are all yours to manage," he said, his gaze sweeping over the men who had gathered to watch. "Miss Hartman's word on the horses is law. Mine and hers are the only ones that matter here." "Understood." A few men mumbled their assent, but their eyes were hostile. They saw her as an interloper, a strange, scarred woman who had somehow bewitched their formidable boss. The hazing started subtly. Tools would go missing from where she had left them. A saddle blanket would be mysteriously soiled. She ignored it, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She focused on the work, and her expertise was undeniable. She reorganized the chaotic tack room, treated a prized mare for a hoof ailment that had baffled the foreman, and began a training regimen that calmed even the most skittish colts. But her quiet competence only seemed to fuel their resentment. A week into her new job, she returned to her cabin late one evening, bone-tired from a long day. When she pulled back the simple quilt on her cot, she found a large, dead frog lying on her pillow, its pale belly upturned, its legs stiff. A wave of revulsion washed over her, followed by a cold, quiet anger. This was not a prank. It was a message. "You do not belong here. You are as ugly and unwelcome as this dead thing." She did not scream. She did not cry. With a grim set to her jaw, she took a shovel, scooped up the frog, and buried it behind the cabin. She then stripped the bedding, washed it in a bucket with harsh soap, and slept that night on the bare mattress, wrapped in her coat. She never said a word to Cole, but he was a man who missed little on his own ranch. The next morning, he assembled all the hands in front of the bunkhouse. His face was like a thundercloud. "I have one question," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Who put the frog in Miss Hartman's bed?" The men shuffled their feet, their eyes on the ground. No one spoke. "Fine," Cole said, his voice cutting like a whip. "You all want to act like children. You can all lose a week's pay. The next time something like this happens, I will not stop at your pay. I will find the man responsible, and he will be fired. Then I will personally see to it that he never finds work in this territory again. Now get back to work." The incident stopped, but Cole's public defense of her had consequences. It solidified her position, but it also drove the men's animosity underground, where it festered like a hidden sore. She was no longer just the strange woman. She was the reason they were a week poorer, a protected species who had the Baron's ear. The whispers in town also grew louder, fanned into flames by Lydia Vane. Lydia saw Abigail's new position as a declaration of war. She began to systematically poison the town's opinion, her words dripping with feigned concern. "It is so sad, is it not," she would say at the sewing circle, "that a man like Cole Travers, in his grief, could be so easily taken advantage of? That woman is no fool. She knows a wealthy, lonely man is an easy target. She plays on his pity to get his money." The lie was simple, venomous, and effective. It recast Abigail as a conniving predator, and Cole as her pitiable victim. Abigail felt the shift in the town's mood, the new edge of contempt that replaced the old pity. But the ranch was a world away from Dust Creek, and the work was a solace. She found a quiet rhythm in her days, a sense of purpose she had not known before. She spent her time in the company of horses, whose judgment was honest and simple. It was during one of her long rides, checking the distant fences on the far edge of the Travers property, that she found him. She was riding through a stretch of arid, rocky land, a place where only sagebrush and hardy grasses grew, when Scout suddenly shied, his ears pricked forward. Abigail followed his gaze and saw a small bundle of rags huddled in the sliver of shade cast by a large boulder. At first, she thought it was a dead animal. Then the bundle moved. She dismounted and approached cautiously. It was a child. A little boy, no older than 4 or 5, with a wild tangle of sun-bleached hair and eyes that were huge and dark and a small face smudged with dirt and tears. He was rail-thin, his clothes little more than tatters, and he was clutching a crudely carved wooden horse. He flinched as she drew near, scrambling back against the rock like a cornered animal. "It is all right," Abigail said, her voice soft. "I will not hurt you." She knelt a respectful distance away, keeping her movements slow. "Are you alone out here?" The boy gave a jerky nod, his eyes welling with fresh tears. He was too terrified to speak. She looked around at the vast, empty landscape. There was no sign of a wagon, no tracks other than the boy's own small footprints. He had been left here, abandoned in the desert, to die. A cold knot of fury and sorrow formed in her stomach. She took a canteen from her saddle and offered it to him. He drank greedily, his small hands trembling. When he was finished, she said gently, "My name is Abigail. What is yours?" He shook his head, looking down at the wooden horse in his hands. He either did not know or would not say. "That is a fine horse," Abigail said, pointing to the toy. "Did you make it?" He nodded again, a flicker of pride in his dark eyes. She knew she could not leave him. She carefully lifted him into her arms. He was shockingly light, a little bag of bones. He stiffened for a moment, then, as if all his strength had run out, he went limp and buried his face in her shoulder. She mounted Scout and, holding the boy securely in front of her, began the long, slow ride back to the ranch. She decided to call him Tommy, a simple, sturdy name. When she arrived back at the ranch house, Cole was on the porch, conferring with his foreman. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw her riding in with the child in her arms. He strode forward, his face a mask of concern. "Abigail, what is this?" "I found him," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she slid from the saddle. "Out by the western ridge." He was alone. Cole looked at the boy, who was now fast asleep, his small, grimy face peaceful against Abigail's dusty shirt. A flicker of an old, deep pain crossed Cole's features. He had lost his wife, and with her, the chance to ever have a child of his own. He looked from the boy's vulnerable form to Abigail's face, seeing the fierce, protective light in her eyes. In that moment, he saw not a scarred outcast, but a woman with a capacity for love and courage that humbled him. He reached out, not for the boy, but to gently brush a strand of hair from Abigail's forehead. It was a simple, unconscious gesture, but it was more intimate than any touch they had ever shared. "Bring him inside," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. "We will get him cleaned up and find him some food." Cole's immediate, unquestioning support was a shield. He sent a rider to the sheriff in Dust Creek to report the found child, but no one came forward to claim him. The boy, Tommy, remained at the T-cross. He was a silent, watchful little ghost at first, but under Abigail's patient care, he slowly began to emerge from his shell. He followed her everywhere, a small, devoted shadow. And Cole, the cold, remote cattle baron, found his heart captured by the small boy and the woman who had saved him. He would watch them from the porch, a small, sad smile touching his lips as Abigail taught Tommy how to properly brush a horse. The news, of course, electrified Dust Creek. Scarred Abby had not just ensnared the Baron, now she had brought a stray child into the mix. Lydia Vane's rumors took on a new, fevered pitch. The woman was a cunning viper, using a poor orphan boy as a pawn to secure her hold on the Travers fortune. The story was so outrageous, so vile, that it became accepted as truth. The pressure on Abigail was immense. She was now responsible for this vulnerable child. Her presence at the ranch was making Cole a target of ridicule and suspicion. Perhaps leaving was the only decent thing to do. She could take Tommy and go somewhere far away, where they could start over, free from the ghosts of Dust Creek. The thought was a constant, painful whisper in the back of her mind. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching Tommy try to teach a patient dog to sit, Cole came and sat beside her. They watched the boy in comfortable silence for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "You are thinking of leaving again," he said softly. She did not deny it. The talk is worse than ever. They are using this child, this innocent boy, to hurt you. It is not right. "I do not care about the talk," he said, his eyes fixed on her. "I care about what is right, and leaving a boy who needs you is not right. Staying here, where you have a home and a purpose, is right." She looked from Cole's earnest face to Tommy, who was now rolling on the ground, laughing as the dog licked his face. She thought of the dead frog on her pillow, of Martha's averted eyes, of Lydia's venomous lies. She thought of a lifetime spent hiding and retreating. Running would be easy, but running would not change who she was. It would not erase the scars, either on her face or on her soul. Cole's words had challenged her once, and now his actions challenged her again. He was offering her not just a job, but a chance to build a life, to stand her ground. She took a deep breath, the clean, sage-scented air filling her lungs. Her choice was clear. She would not run, not for herself, and certainly not for the little boy who had found his way into her heart. She would stay. She would face the whispers and the stares, the hatred and the ignorance. She would stay, if only to prove to them all, and finally to herself, that she was not the monster they had created. Her decision to stay settled over the T-Cross Ranch like a quiet dawn. It was a choice made not with defiance, but with a weary, newfound resolve. The days that followed found a new rhythm. Cole gave her space, yet his presence was a constant, steadying force. He would appear at the stables with a question about a horse, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. He began taking his evening meal not in the main house, but on the porch of his foreman, a spot that overlooked her small cabin and the corral where Tommy often played. They were two solitary islands, slowly, cautiously, beginning to acknowledge the current that flowed between them. A month after she had found Tommy, a report came in of a cougar preying on calves in the northern pastures. It was a long ride, a full day's journey to the edge of the Travers property. It was work Cole would normally delegate, but this time, he did not. He found her at dusk as she was finishing her work, the scent of hay and horse sweat clinging to her. "I am riding out to the North Range tonight," he said, his voice even. "The moon will be bright enough to see by. I want to check the herd and the water levels at Sagebrush Creek. I could use another rider, another set of eyes." It was not a command, but an invitation. She knew his men were more than capable. This was something else. "Tommy is asleep," she said, her heart giving a small, uncertain flutter. The foreman's wife said she would look in on him. He simply nodded, as if her acceptance had been a foregone conclusion. An hour later, they were riding out, leaving the warm lights of the ranch behind them. The land opened up, vast and silent, bathed in the ethereal silver of a full moon. The world was transformed. The harsh, sun-beaten landscape of daytime softened into a dream of pale earth and black shadows. The sagebrush glowed, each bush a ghostly puff of silver. The only sounds were the soft thud of their horses' hooves on the packed earth and the gentle creak of saddle leather. For the first hour, they rode in a comfortable silence, a shared quiet that was no longer awkward. It was Cole who finally spoke, his voice a low rumble in the immense stillness. "You are good with the boy," he said. "He is easy to be good to," Abigail replied. "He just needed a safe place, someone to be kind." "Kindness is not a common currency out here," Cole observed, his gaze on the distant horizon. "No," she agreed softly. "It is not?" The simple exchange seemed to open a door between them. He asked her about her life before the fire, and for the first time in years, she let herself remember. She spoke of a small farm, of her mother's garden, of learning to ride on a gentle old plow horse. As she spoke, she found herself smiling, a real, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. She told him how she used to sneak out to the barn to read by lantern light, and a low chuckle rumbled in his chest. It was the first time she had ever heard him laugh, a genuine sound of amusement, and it was a revelation. It chipped away another piece of the cold, hard stone of his reputation. Emboldened, she asked a question of her own. "What about you? What was your childhood like?" He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then he began to speak of a hardscrabble life, of a father who worked him from sunup to sundown, teaching him about cattle and the unforgiving nature of the land. He spoke of it without bitterness, but with a simple, factual weariness. There had been no room for books or boyish games in his world. Only work. It was a stark contrast to her own brief, happy childhood. And she understood then that his solitude had been forged long before tragedy had found him. They rode on, the moon climbing higher in the black sky. The conversation flowed more easily now. A quiet stream in the vast desert night. As they crested a low hill, Cole reined in his horse and looked out over the valley below, where a silver ribbon of creek wound through the land, his cattle sleeping peacefully in dark, unmoving clumps. "She loved nights like this," he said, his voice so quiet it was almost carried away by the breeze. "My wife, Eleanor, she said the moon washed the world clean of its sins." Abigail's heart constricted. He had never spoken of his wife to anyone, not in all the years since her death. The town knew the story of the robbery, but nothing of the woman herself. For him to speak of her now, to Abigail, felt like a sacred trust. She remained silent, giving him the space to continue if he chose. "She was from back east," he went on, his eyes lost in memory. "She was not meant for this land. It was too hard, too empty for her, but she tried. She filled the house with flowers and music. She tried to tame this place. Tame me, I suppose." A sad, faint smile touched his lips. "The robbery, it was my fault. I should have been with her on that stagecoach, but I was here. Chasing down a few head of stray cattle, I chose the ranch over her, and she paid the price for it." The guilt in his voice was a raw, open wound. Abigail's heart ached for him, for the lonely man who had buried his grief under a mountain of land and wealth. Without thinking, she reached out and laid a hand on his forearm. Through the thick fabric of his coat, she could feel the tension in his muscles. "That is not your burden to carry," she said softly. He looked at her then, his eyes dark with an ancient pain, and in them she saw a profound sorrow that she mistook for something else. It looked so much like the pity she had seen in the eyes of others her entire life. Her hand recoiled as if burned. "You do not need to pity me, Cole," she said, her voice suddenly stiff, her old defenses slamming back into place. "I know what I look like. I do not need your sympathy." His expression hardened. A flash of confusion and then something else. Something sharp. In his eyes, he urged his horse closer to hers. until their knees were almost touching. "Pity you," he said, his voice low and intense. "Abigail, look at me." She forced herself to meet his gaze. "I have never pitied you, not for a single moment. From the first day I saw you, I saw strength. I saw a woman who could gentle a 1,000-pound stallion with a whisper and face down a town full of fools without flinching. I have never once felt sorry for you." His words were a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs and dismantling her defenses piece by piece. He did not see a broken thing. He saw her. He had always seen her, as if the heavens themselves were responding to the sudden, turbulent emotion between them. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. The stars began to disappear behind a sudden bank of clouds. A low roll of thunder echoed in the distance. The weather on the plains was a fickle thing. A sudden, violent summer squall was upon them. "We need to find shelter," Cole said, his voice urgent. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, cold and fat, splattering in the dust. He led the way, guiding them toward a dark outcropping of rock at the base of a mesa. They reached it just as the sky opened up. The rain came down in a torrential, blinding sheet, turning the world into a roaring curtain of gray. They found a shallow cave, little more than a deep overhang in the rock face, but it was dry. They tethered the horses just outside, where they stood stoically with their backs to the driving rain. Inside the small space, the air was cool and smelled of damp earth and stone. The roar of the storm outside created an intense, profound intimacy. They were two people alone, sealed off from the rest of the world. Shivering, Abigail wrapped her arms around herself. Cole moved deeper into the cave and, after a moment, managed to start a small fire with a flint and steel from his saddlebag and a handful of dry scrub he found tucked in a crevice. The tiny flame caught, grew, and pushed back the darkness, casting flickering, dancing shadows on the cave walls. The small blaze threw off a welcome warmth. They sat close to the fire, their shoulders nearly touching. The light played across their faces, throwing his rugged features into sharp relief and softening the scarred landscape of hers. Neither of them spoke. The words they had exchanged on the hill still hung in the air between them. He had seen strength in her, not ruin. The knowledge was a fire inside her, warmer than the flames in front of them. Slowly, as if he were approaching a nervous colt, Cole lifted his hand. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. His calloused fingers, gentle as a whisper, touched her cheek. Not her good side. He touched the scarred side. He traced the raised, puckered line of the worst of the burns, from her temple down to her jaw. She trembled, a violent, full-body shudder, her eyes closed, bracing for the revulsion. The flinch of disgust that had always followed such a touch in her imagination. But it never came. His touch was not one of morbid curiosity or pity. It was tender. It was reverent. It was as if he were reading a story written in a language only he could understand. When she dared to open her eyes, she saw that his own were filled with a deep, aching compassion that had nothing to do with pity. It was a look of profound understanding. He was not looking at her scars. He was looking at her survival. He leaned in, his gaze never leaving hers. The world seemed to shrink to the small space between their faces, filled with the warmth of the fire and their own unsteady breaths. And then he kissed her. It was not a practiced, polished kiss. It was hesitant at first, then deep and searching. A kiss that tasted of rain and wood smoke and a loneliness so profound it had taken a lifetime to brave this moment. It was a kiss that trembled with the raw, unspoken emotions of two broken people finding a fragile wholeness in each other. It was as unsteady and as powerful as the desert wind. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathless. The roar of the storm outside seemed to fade to a distant murmur. He rested his forehead against hers, his hand still cradling her scarred cheek. "You are not ugly, Abby," he whispered, his voice thick and raw. "You are the most precious thing I have ever known. You are my greatest treasure." The words were the key that unlocked the last, most heavily guarded door to her heart. A single tear escaped from her closed eye. Then another. She was not weeping from sorrow or shame, but from a joy so overwhelming it was painful. It was a happiness she had never believed she was worthy of. A gift so unexpected she was afraid her heart might break from the sheer wonder of it. She was afraid, and she was, for the first time in her life, incandescently happy. They stayed there for the rest of the night, wrapped in a blanket from his saddle roll, dozing in the warmth of the dying fire as the storm raged and then finally exhausted itself. They did not speak much more. They did not need to. Everything that mattered had already been said. As the first pale, gray light of dawn began to filter into the sky, they rode back to the ranch. The air was clean and cool. The desert landscape washed new by the rain. A fragile, unspoken promise hung in the air between them. But as the familiar shapes of the ranch buildings grew on the horizon, a sense of foreboding settled in Abigail's stomach. The world they had created for themselves in the moonlight, and the storm was a fragile sanctuary. The world of sunlight and other people was still waiting for them, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it would not welcome their newfound peace. The quiet intimacy they had found in the moonlit cave did not survive the harsh light of the following day. It returned with them to the T-Cross, but as a ghost, a fragile, shimmering thing that only they could see. There were no open displays of affection, no grand declarations. Instead, it lived in the small spaces between them, a shared glance across the dusty corral that held for a beat too long. The way Cole's voice softened almost imperceptibly when he spoke her name, the faint, unconscious smile that would touch Abigail's lips as she watched him ride out. It was a subtle but profound shift, a change in the emotional landscape of the ranch, and like a change in the wind, everyone felt it, even if they could not name it. The first tremor of the coming earthquake was a ranch hand named Slim, a talkative man with a thirst for whiskey, on a trip into Dust Creek for supplies. He had 2 drinks at the saloon and let his tongue run loose. He spoke of how the Baron was not the same man lately, how his eyes always seemed to be following the scarred woman, how they had ridden out together and not returned until dawn. It was all he had, a handful of observations, but in the fertile ground of the town's prejudice, it was more than enough. The seed of gossip took root and grew into a monstrous weed overnight. The news spread through Dust Creek with the speed of a prairie fire. Baron Travers was not just employing the scarred woman. He was courting her. The notion was so scandalous, so contrary to the town's rigid sense of order, that it became the sole topic of conversation. It was a freak show, a spectacle for them to chew on. The story twisted with each telling, becoming more lurid, more grotesque. She had enchanted him. They said she had used her pathetic state to trap him, a black widow snaring him in a web of pity. The laughter that had once been aimed solely at her was now directed at him as well. The great Cole Travers, the cattle king, brought low by a monster. The consequences for Cole were swift and real. His authority, once as solid as the land he owned, began to erode. Men who had once feared him now smirked behind his back. A rival rancher, a shrewd and ambitious man named Silas Blackwood, saw his opportunity. Blackwood had long coveted a piece of land that bordered the T-Cross, land with crucial water rights. He began to whisper in the ears of the members of the local council. He spoke of Cole's erratic behavior, his poor judgment. A man who would take up with a creature like that, Blackwood would say, his voice thick with false concern, is not a man thinking clearly. His grief over his wife has finally broken him. Can we trust such a man to manage the most important ranch in this territory? The whispers worked. A planned land auction was postponed. A contract for supplying beef to the army was put under review. Cole's word, once as good as gold, was now tarnished with suspicion. For Abigail, the backlash was more personal and far more brutal. The following Sunday, driven by a small, stubborn flicker of faith and a desire for Tommy to have some semblance of a normal life, She took the boy to the small church in town. She had not set foot in it for years, but she dressed in her best clean dress, scrubbed Tommy's face until it shone, and walked in with her head held as high as she could manage. The service was a trial by fire. The whispers were like the buzzing of angry wasps. The stares were a physical weight, pressing down on her. She felt the congregation shrink away from her as if she carried a plague. But she endured it, for Tommy's sake, her hand resting protectively on his small shoulder. After the final hymn, as the congregation filed out, the pastor, a severe man named Reverend Miller, asked her to stay behind. He did not invite her into his office. He stood in the aisle, his Bible clutched in his hand like a weapon, his face a mask of grim piety. "Miss Hartman," he began, his voice cold, "your presence here is a disruption to the flock. It is a source of unseemly gossip." "I only came to pray, Reverend," Abigail said, her voice barely a whisper. "Prayer cannot change what is," he said, his eyes finally dropping to her face, his expression devoid of all compassion. He gestured to her scars. "The Lord marks us all for our sins, or the sins of our fathers. A face such as yours is a heavy burden, a sign of some past transgression. It is a punishment, to flaunt it in the house of God, to use it to tempt a good, grieving man like Mr. Travers away from decency. It's a sacrilege. You are no longer welcome here." The words were a hammer blow to her soul, a punishment. In all the years of taunts and insults, no one had ever said anything so utterly cruel, so completely devastating. She felt the fragile hope that had bloomed in her heart wither and die. She grabbed Tommy's hand and fled the church, the pastor's righteous gaze boring into her back. The walk back to the ranch was a blur of pain. She began to doubt everything. What if the pastor was right? What if she was a curse? She looked at her reflection in a water trough, and for the first time in weeks, she saw not the woman Cole had called a treasure, but the monster the town saw. She was dragging him down, destroying his name, his business, his life. The love she felt for him began to feel like a selfish, destructive thing. The guilt was a poison, seeping into her, making her question the truth of that night in the cave. Had he really meant what he said? Or was she just a broken toy he had picked up out of pity, a temporary distraction from his real life? Lydia Vane watched all of this unfold with savage satisfaction. The town's scorn was not enough. She wanted Cole Travers, and she wanted Abigail Hartman destroyed. She saw her chance to strike a final, decisive blow. She penned a note in her elegant script and sent it to the T-Cross with a young boy. The note was addressed to Cole and spoke of an urgent business opportunity, a chance to buy a prime herd of cattle from a rancher who was moving out of the territory. The deal had to be made in cash, and it had to be made that night. She asked him to meet her in the private room above the saloon to finalize the details. It was a perfect lie, a lure he could not easily ignore. Cole received the note with suspicion. He had no love for Lydia, but the deal she described was too good to dismiss without inquiry, against his better judgment. He rode into town that evening, his mind preoccupied. Abigail saw him leave. He had been distant all day, his face grim. Her insecure heart immediately leaped to the worst conclusion. He was tired of her, tired of the trouble she had brought him. He was riding into town to seek more pleasant company. Her fears festered. Later that evening, she realized Tommy was developing a cough, and she had run out of the whorehound candy she used to soothe it. Using the boy's cough as an excuse for her own desperate need to know, she hitched a small buckboard and drove into Dust Creek. As she passed the saloon, she saw a light on in one of the upstairs windows. The curtains were not fully drawn, and in the frame of that window, she saw a scene that stopped her heart. She saw Cole's broad back, and she saw Lydia Vane in front of him. Lydia's arms were wrapped around his neck, her head thrown back. From the street, it looked like a passionate embrace. It was, in fact, a carefully staged deception. Lydia had thrown herself at him the moment he entered the room, and he was in the process of pushing her away, his hands on her arms, his face a mask of fury. But Abigail could not see his face. She could only see his back and Lydia's triumphant posture. It was a tableau that confirmed every single one of her deepest, most agonizing fears. He had been toying with her. He had lied. She was, and had always been, a fool. A sound, a small, wounded cry, escaped her lips. She did not even realize she had made it. She slapped the reins and the horse lunged forward. She drove back to the ranch in a blind panic, tears streaming down her face, freezing in the cold night air. The pain was a living thing inside her, a wild animal tearing her apart. She could not stay. She could not face him. She could not live another day as his object of pity. She burst into her cabin, her mind a maelstrom of grief and shame. She woke a sleeping Tommy, bundling him into a warm coat. The boy was confused and frightened by her frantic movements. She scribbled a hasty, incoherent note, leaving it on the table. Then she saddled a sturdy but unremarkable mare from the stables, lifted Tommy into the saddle in front of her, and rode out into the night. She did not know where she was going. She was simply running, fleeing from a heartbreak so immense she was sure it would kill her. Back in the saloon, Cole shoved Lydia away from him with such force that she stumbled and fell. "What is the meaning of this?" he roared, his voice shaking with rage. "I am simply offering you the comfort you so clearly need," she said, recovering quickly, a sly smile on her face. "I need nothing from you," he snarled. "There is no cattle deal, is there?" He saw the truth in her eyes. He had been played for a fool. He turned and stormed out of the room, leaving her there, on his way out of town. He pushed past a group of men who were snickering, and he knew that they had been posted there to witness the scene. The entire thing had been a setup. He rode back to the ranch, his anger a cold, hard knot in his gut. He went straight to Abigail's cabin to explain, to tell her what a venomous snake Lydia Vane was. He found the cabin empty. The fire was cold. The note was on the table, her handwriting jagged and almost illegible. It spoke of shame, of not wanting to be a burden, of setting him free. And then he knew. She had seen. She had been in town and had seen Lydia's trap and had believed it. A wave of cold dread washed over him, more terrifying than any anger. He ran to the stables. A horse was missing, and Abigail and Tommy were gone. He looked to the west, and his blood ran cold. The horizon was a dark, angry line. The wind was picking up, carrying the first telltale sting of sand. Another storm was coming, a bad one. And she was out there, alone with the boy, heading straight into it. He did not hesitate. He saddled Diablo, his strongest and fastest horse. He grabbed a canteen and a coil of rope and rode out into the gathering darkness, into the teeth of the rising wind. The storm hit with a sudden, violent fury. The world disappeared into a roaring, brown abyss. The wind was a physical force, trying to tear him from the saddle. The sand was like 1,000 tiny needles against his skin, blinding him, choking him. He shouted her name, the sound swallowed by the gale. For hours he rode, a desperate, frantic search in a world without landmarks. He was guided only by a grim instinct, pushing his horse and himself past the point of exhaustion. Diablo stumbled, nearly throwing him. He became disoriented, turning in circles, the fear in his gut a cold, hard knot. He was a man who knew this land better than he knew himself, but in the heart of the storm, he was as lost as she was. He was beginning to lose hope, his body screaming with fatigue, his throat raw. When he heard it, a faint sound on the wind, a child's cry. He urged Diablo in the direction of the sound, his heart pounding with a desperate, renewed hope. He found them huddled in the lee of a small, rocky outcrop. The mare stood nearby, its head down, utterly spent. Abigail was on the ground, her body curled around Tommy, shielding him from the worst of the wind with her own back. She had wrapped the boy in her coat and was shivering uncontrollably in her thin dress. She looked up as he approached, her face a pale, ghostly oval in the gloom. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She was at the end of her strength, her spirit broken. He half fell, half slid from the saddle and staggered toward them, his own legs unsteady. He dropped to his knees in the swirling sand. He had no words. He simply reached out and pulled both of them into his arms, holding them tight against his own exhausted body. He buried his face in her hair, which was stiff with sand. He felt the tremors that racked her body, felt the small, frightened shudder of the boy pressed between them. They clung to each other. 3 small, lost souls in the heart of a vast, indifferent storm, survivors of a tempest that was both outside and within. The ride back to the T-Cross was a journey through a world reborn. The storm had scoured the air clean, leaving it crisp and tasting of rain and damp earth. A pale, exhausted sun rose over the horizon, casting long, soft shadows across the landscape. They moved slowly, a small, weary procession of 3 horses and 3 battered souls. Cole rode Diablo, leading the spent mare that Abigail had taken. Abigail herself sat behind him, her arms wrapped loosely around his waist, her cheek resting against the solid warmth of his back. Tommy was a small, sleeping bundle cradled in front of Cole, cocooned in the cattleman's heavy coat. They did not speak. There were no words for the terror of the storm or the profound relief of their survival. When they finally reached the ranch, the foreman and his wife rushed out, their face etched with worry. The woman, a kind, sturdy soul named Helen, immediately took Tommy, clucking over him like a mother hen and carrying him into the main house. Cole dismounted and then turned, lifting a weary Abigail down from the horse. For a moment, he simply held her, his hands on her waist, his eyes searching her face in the clear morning light. She looked fragile, her skin pale and smudged with dirt, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. But she was there, she was safe. That was all that mattered. He led her into the quiet of the main ranch house, a place she had never entered before. It was a masculine space filled with dark wood, leather, and the faint scent of old smoke and polish. But Helen had brought a woman's touch to it, keeping it clean and orderly. She settled Abigail into a large armchair by the cold hearth and pressed a cup of hot, sweet coffee into her hands. Cole stood by the mantel, his back to her, staring into the empty fireplace. "It was a trap, Abigail," he said, his voice low and rough. "Lydia Vane. There was no cattle deal. She staged the whole thing. She had men from the saloon watching, waiting to spread the story." Abigail clutched the warm cup, the heat seeping into her cold fingers. She had known, somewhere in the rational part of her mind, that it must have been a lie. "But the heart is not a rational thing. I saw," she whispered. "I am sorry. I should not have run. I put Tommy in danger." He turned to face her then, and the look in his eyes was one of deep, soul-weary pain. "You ran because I gave you reason to doubt. I should have seen what Lydia was planning. I should have protected you from it. From them." He took a step toward her, his expression grim. "This ends. Today." He did not know how right he was. A rider from Dust Creek arrived an hour later. His horse lathered. There was to be an emergency town meeting at noon. Silas Blackwood had called it. The official topic was the organization of a volunteer fire brigade, a flimsy pretext everyone saw through. The real reason was Cole Travers and the scandal that now engulfed him. His reckless, overnight ride into a sandstorm after the runaway scarred woman and the orphan boy was the final straw. It was proof. Blackwood was arguing that Travers was unstable, his judgment compromised. It was a public tribunal, and he was the one on trial. Cole's jaw tightened. He sent the rider away and turned to Abigail. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Helen will look after you and the boy. This is my fight." The town hall was packed. It was a hot, airless room that smelled of sawdust and sweat and the collective, feverish excitement of a crowd anticipating a hanging. Every chair was filled, and men stood 3 deep along the walls. The women of the town. in a rare break from custom, were also there, gathered in a somber cluster at the back. Silas Blackwood stood at the front, looking confident and righteous. Beside him, looking pale but composed, was Lydia Vane. Blackwood let the crowd settle, then began to speak. He spoke of community and responsibility, of the need for steady leadership. He did not mention Cole by name at first, but everyone knew who he was talking about. He spoke of erratic behavior, of a man whose personal grief had clouded his business sense, making him a danger to the town's prosperity. Then he turned the floor over to Lydia. She stepped forward, the picture of wronged womanhood. She spoke in a soft, sorrowful voice, telling a masterful story of how she had tried to help a troubled man, only to have her good intentions twisted. She hinted at Abigail's manipulative nature, painting her as a cunning opportunist who had preyed on Cole's kindness. She saw in him a lonely man of means, Lydia said, dabbing at a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. She used her unfortunate appearance and a parentless child to weave a web of pity and obligation around him, a web he is now too entangled to escape. She is a danger to him, and through him, to all of us. A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. Then, a new voice cut through the room, hesitant but clear. She is right. A path cleared as Martha Thorne, the sheriff's wife, stepped forward. Abigail's sister. Her face was ashen, her hands twisted together in front of her. She did not look at the crowd, but at a fixed point on the floor. "I am Abigail Hartman's sister," she said, the admission costing her dearly. "I know her better than anyone. My sister has always been grasping. The fire that took our parents, it marked her. It twisted something inside her. She sees what others have, and she wants it. Lydia is right to be concerned. My sister has bewitched that poor man, and she will be the ruin of him." The betrayal was so absolute, so shocking, that it stunned the room into a momentary silence. Martha had sacrificed her own sister on the altar of public opinion to protect her own fragile social standing. It was the final, damning piece of evidence. The mood in the room turned ugly, a low growl of consensus. Cole Travers was finished. It was into this charged, hostile atmosphere that the door at the back of the hall swung open. Cole Travers stood there. He was not dressed for a meeting. He still wore his trail clothes, dusty and worn from the storm. His face was unshaven. His eyes were bloodshot with exhaustion. But as he swept his gaze over the assembled townspeople, there was a cold, quiet fury in his expression that made the murmuring die in their throats. He walked slowly down the central aisle, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden floor. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea. He did not look at Blackwood or Lydia. He walked until he stood directly in front of Martha Thorne. He looked down at her, and she visibly shrank from the contempt in his eyes. He said nothing to her. He did not need to. With a final, withering look, he dismissed her, turning to face the rest of the town. "I came here today because I heard you were talking about my property," he began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that carried to every corner of the room. "You seem to be confused. You talk about my land, my cattle, my judgment. But you have spent the morning discussing the only thing of any real value I possess. And I will not have you speak of her that way." He turned his head and looked at them all, one by one, his gaze lingering on the men who had laughed at her in the saloon, on the women who had whispered behind her back, on the grim face of Reverend Miller. "You look at Abigail Hartman, and you see her face," he said, his voice ringing with a power they had never heard from him before. "You laugh at her scars. You call her a monster. You, who hide your own petty, cowardly hearts behind a mask of piety and decency. You dare to judge her." He took a step closer to the center of the room, his presence dominating the space. "Let me tell you what I see. I see a woman who was burned saving her sister's life. I see a woman who would risk her own life in a storm for a lost calf. I see a woman who found a child left to die in the desert and took him in. gave him a home when no one else would. In this land, this hard, unforgiving country, we are taught that strength is what matters. But you are all mistaken about what strength is. It is not in the speed of a man's gun or the size of his herd. The most beautiful, the most powerful thing in this world is courage. And there is no one in this room who has a fraction of the courage that woman has in her heart. He paused, and the silence in the room was absolute. It was a silence born of shock and shame. He had held up a mirror to them, and they did not like the reflection. You laugh at her because you think her face is ugly. Cole's voice dropped, becoming thick with an emotion that stunned them all. But you are the blind ones. She is the greatest treasure I have ever known. She is my greatest treasure. From the back of the room, a sound broke the stillness. A single, choked sob. Helen, the foreman's wife, had brought Abigail. She had refused to be left behind, to let him fight this battle alone. She had slipped in the back and had heard every word. Her tears were not of sorrow, but of a vindication so profound it felt like a physical release, washing away years of shame and pain. A few people in the crowd began to whisper. A few heads nodded in reluctant agreement. The blacksmith, a man who respected hard work above all else, let out a low grunt of approval. The tide of opinion, which had been a solid wall of condemnation, was beginning to crack. Cole saw the shift. He saw the doubt on their faces, and he knew he had to seal it. He looked toward the back of the room, his eyes finding Abigail's, and in front of the entire town of Dust Creek, he made his final stand. "So you will understand this," he called out, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. "This is not a matter for town gossip. This is a matter of my life. I am going to marry Abigail Hartman. She has done me the great honor of agreeing to be my wife." The gasp that went through the room was a collective shock. This was no longer a scandal. It was an engagement, a public, binding declaration that defied every one of their petty rules. Martha Thorne let out a small, strangled cry and fled the room, her face buried in her hands, her shame complete. Lydia Vane's mask of composure finally shattered. "You fool!" she shrieked, her voice a venomous hiss, her beautiful face twisted with rage. "She has tricked you. She has blinded you. You will regret this." Her hysterical outburst laid her desperate, grasping nature bare for all to see. Silas Blackwood stood frozen, his power play in ruins around him. Cole ignored them. His eyes were only for Abigail. He walked back down the aisle toward her, the crowd parting for him once more. He stopped in front of her, and gently, with a tenderness that defied the hostile eyes upon them, he wiped a tear from her cheek. He did not care that they were all watching. Let them watch. That night, they sat together on the porch of the main house. The wind, now a gentle breeze, carried the scent of sage and the distant, peaceful sound of the herd. Tommy was asleep inside, safe and warm. For a long time, they were silent, listening to the sounds of the prairie. Finally, Abigail spoke, her voice a whisper in the darkness. "You will regret this, Cole." He turned to look at her, his silhouette dark against the star-filled sky. A slow smile touched his lips, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Abigail," he said, his voice soft but sure, "for 6 years, I have lived with regret for the things I did and for the things I did not do. It has been my constant companion, a ghost in this house, looking at you. I feel many things, but regret is not one of them. You are the first thing in a long time that I am sure of." The public declaration at the town hall did not bring peace, but a tense and watchful quiet. The town of Dust Creek was a fractured thing, split between those who saw a love story and those who saw a disgrace. But on the T-Cross Ranch, a fragile peace did settle. The declaration had burned away the uncertainty between Cole and Abigail, leaving behind the solid bedrock of commitment. They began to build a life in the small, quiet moments. They ate their meals together in the main house, The three of them, a strange and patched-together family at the long wooden table. Cole, his face losing some of its harsh, weary lines, would watch with a quiet intensity as Abigail patiently taught Tommy to read his letters. Abigail, in turn, felt the tight knot of fear in her chest slowly unwind. She started to smile more, a genuine, unburdened expression that lit her eyes and softened the landscape of her face. For the first time since she was a child, she felt she belonged somewhere. She felt safe. This new, fragile peace was a personal and profound insult to Lydia Vane. Her public humiliation had been absolute. Cole's rejection and Abigail's triumph had curdled in her soul, transforming her ambition into a black, venomous hatred. Her beauty and social cunning, the only weapon she had ever valued, had failed her. All that was left was a scorched earth desire for revenge. If she could not have Cole Travers' kingdom, she would see it burn. She rode out from Dust Creek under the cover of darkness, her face veiled, her destination a wretched collection of shacks and lean-tos huddled in a dry canyon 20 miles south. This was the den of the Rimstone Gang, a pack of human coyotes led by a ruthless man named Jedediah Kane. They were not clever thieves or strategic outlaws. They were brutal thugs, men who thrived on chaos and violence, hiring themselves out for the dirtiest of work. Lydia found Kane in a smoke-filled tent, a hulking man with a scarred face of his own, though his had been carved by knives and fists, not by fire. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She placed a heavy leather pouch on the rickety table between them. The clink of coins was the only language men like Kane truly understood. "I want the T-Cross Ranch burned to the ground," she said, her voice cold and devoid of emotion. "I want Cole Travers to watch everything he has built turn to ash. And I want the boy, the orphan boy. I want you to bring him to me." Kane's eyes, small and greedy, lit up. Fire and destruction were his trade. Kidnapping a child was a bonus. And the man himself, he grunted. "If he gets in your way, kill him," Lydia said without a flicker of hesitation. "Just make sure he sees his world die first." 4 nights later, the attack came. It came without warning. In the dead, moonless heart of the night, the peace of the T-Cross was shattered by the sudden, panicked screaming of horses and the hellish orange glow that blossomed against the black sky. The Rimstone Gang descended not like a disciplined force, but like a wave of pure destruction. They rode through the ranch yard with torches held high, whooping and firing their pistols into the air. They set fire to the main barn first, the massive structure filled with dry hay going up like a tinderbox, the flames roaring into the sky, a beacon of chaos. Cole was out of his bed in an instant, pulling on his boots and grabbing the rifle he kept by his door. He met his foreman in the yard, who was already trying to organize the terrified ranch hands. "Get the horses out of the stables," Cole roared over the din. "Get to the well, form a bucket line. Try to save the bunkhouse." Abigail's first thought was Tommy. She ran to the small room where he slept, finding him sitting bolt upright in his bed, his eyes wide with terror at the roaring sounds and the flickering, demonic light outside his window. She scooped him into her arms, murmuring soothing words that she did not feel herself. "It is all right. Little one, we are all right." Cole saw them in the doorway of the house as he was directing his men. "Abigail, stay inside," he yelled, his face grim in the firelight. "Bar the door." But as he turned, a figure emerged from the smoke, a man with a wild beard and a crazed look in his eyes. He leveled a pistol at Cole. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Abigail saw the man. She saw the flash of the muzzle. She screamed Cole's name. Cole staggered back, a grunt of pain torn from his lips. He clutched at his side, a dark stain blossoming on his shirt. He did not fall, but his rifle clattered to the ground. In that same instant of chaos, another rider swooped in from the darkness. Before Abigail could process what was happening, the man leaned down from his saddle and snatched Tommy from her arms. The boy let out a single, terrified shriek. The man wheeled his horse around and disappeared back into the smoke and confusion. Tommy Abigail screamed. a raw, primal sound of pure horror. She started to run after them, but the yard was a maelstrom of panicked men and animals. Cole, leaning heavily against the porch railing, saw the kidnapping. Rage and adrenaline cut through the searing pain in his side. He tried to push himself forward, but his legs buckled. "No," he grunted, his voice a strained whisper. The world narrowed for Abigail. The fire, the shouting, the danger to herself. It all ceased to exist. All that mattered was the small, precious boy who had been stolen from her. Her mind, which had been frozen in terror, was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. She would not be a victim. She would not stand here and watch her world be destroyed again. She ran back to where Cole had dropped his rifle, scooping the heavy Winchester from the dust. She did not look at him, did not dare to see the extent of his injury. She knew if she stopped, her courage would fail. She ran to the corral, where the horses were screaming and plunging in terror. Her own horse, Scout, was among them. She spoke to him in a low, urgent voice, the calm in her tone cutting through his panic. She threw a saddle on his back with a speed and efficiency born of years of practice. She grabbed a box of cartridges from the tack room, stuffed them into her pocket, and swung herself into the saddle. She rode out of the ranch yard like a fury, a scarred, avenging angel armed with a rifle she barely knew how to use, her only guide the direction in which the kidnapper had fled. The fire behind her lit her path, casting long, dancing shadows in front of her. The chase was a desperate, punishing ride through the dark. She pushed Scout harder than she ever had before, his hooves pounding a frantic rhythm against the hard, dry earth. The air was still thick with the smoke from the burning ranch, which now mingled with the dust kicked up by the riders ahead of her. She could see them in the distance, two dark shapes against the slowly lightening eastern sky. As the sun began to rise, it revealed a scorched and brutal landscape. The chase led them into a region of badlands, a maze of canyons and rock formations that offered 1,000 places to hide. Her hope began to dwindle. How could she find them in this wilderness? But then she saw a puff of dust rise from a narrow ravine to her left. They were there. She dismounted, tethering Scout to a scrubby bush. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. Her hands were slick with sweat as she chambered a round into the Winchester. It was heavy, unfamiliar. She crept forward, using the rocks for cover, her movements as silent as a predator's. She peered over a ledge and saw them. One man was holding the reins of their horses. The other was pulling a terrified, weeping Tommy toward the mouth of a small cave. Lydia Vane was there, waiting, her face a pale, triumphant mask in the morning light. Abigail rested the rifle on the rock, just as she had seen Cole do 100 times when he was hunting. She tried to steady her breathing, to quell the shaking in her hands. She centered the iron sight on the man holding the horses. He was the bigger threat. He could give chase. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the report shockingly loud in the quiet canyon. The man with the horses grunted and spun around, a look of pure surprise on his face, before he collapsed in a heap. The other outlaw froze, dropping Tommy's arm and drawing his own pistol, his eyes frantically scanning the canyon rim. "Get the boy and get out of here," Lydia shrieked at him, her voice shrill with a sudden, unexpected fear. In that moment of confusion, Abigail scrambled down a steep, rocky path into the ravine. She did not have time to reload. She ran, her only thought to get between the gunman and Tommy. The boy saw her and cried out. "Abby," he ran toward her, his small legs pumping. The outlaw turned, raising his pistol to fire at the child. But before he could, a second shot rang out. This one from the top of the canyon. The gunman cried out and clutched his shoulder, his pistol falling from his grasp. Cole stood on the canyon rim, leaning heavily against a boulder, his own rifle smoking in his hand. His face was a deathly gray, and his shirt was soaked in blood. But he was there. He had followed her. Despite his wound, despite the pain, he had come for them. He had strapped himself into the saddle to keep from falling, and the effort it had cost him was etched on his face. He staggered down the same path Abigail had taken, his movements slow and agonizing. The wounded outlaw, seeing he was outmatched, turned and fled, scrambling up the far side of the ravine. Lydia Vane stood frozen for a moment, her face a mask of disbelief and pure hatred. She looked from the wounded Cole to the determined Abigail, and then she, too, turned and ran. But Cole's foreman and 2 other ranch hands, who had followed their boss, appeared at the top of the canyon, cutting off her escape. Her flight was over. Cole reached the bottom of the canyon just as Abigail swept Tommy into her arms, holding him so tight he could barely breathe. Cole leaned his rifle against a rock and slid down to the ground, his back against the canyon wall, the last of his strength finally giving out. Abigail ran to him, Tommy still clinging to her. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over the bloody wound in his side. His breathing was shallow, his eyes unfocused. He had lost too much blood. The adrenaline that had driven him was gone, and there was nothing left. "Cole," she whispered, her voice breaking. She touched his face, his skin alarmingly cold and clammy. He managed to focus on her, a faint, ghostly smile touching his lips. "My treasure," he rasped, his voice barely audible. His eyes fluttered and closed, his head lolled to the side. A wave of pure, cold terror washed over Abigail, a fear far worse than anything she had felt during the fire or the chase. She gathered him into her arms, pulling his head onto her lap. The blood from his wound soaked into the fabric of her dress, a warm, wet stain that spread across her skirt. She held him, rocking him gently, the vast, silent canyon her witness. Tears streamed down her face, falling onto his pale, still features. "No," she whispered to the empty air, to the man she loved, to whatever God might be listening. "If I am your treasure, you cannot leave me. Please do not leave me behind." The foreman and his men reached the bottom of the canyon to find a scene of desperate, silent prayer. Abigail was a statue of grief, cradling the unconscious form of their boss, her dress a horrifying canvas of red and brown. The foreman, a pragmatic man named Ben, took one look at Cole's ashen face and the sheer amount of blood, and felt a cold stone of dread settle in his stomach. But there was no time for despair. They worked with a grim, focused urgency. They fashioned a makeshift litter from rifles and saddle blankets, carefully lifting Cole onto it. The journey back to the ranch was an agonizing, slow-motion nightmare. Every jolt, every jostle of the horses threatened to sever the fragile thread of life that remained in Cole's body. Abigail walked beside the litter, one hand resting on Cole's chest, as if she could will her own strength into him through her touch. Her face was a mask of stoic determination, but her eyes never left his, searching for any flicker of life. Tommy, his small face streaked with tears and dust, was held securely by one of the ranch hands, his gaze fixed on the woman who was his entire world. By the time they reached the T-Cross, the sun was high and hot, glinting off the still smoldering ruins of the great barn. The news of their return, and of Cole's condition, spread like wildfire. A rider had been dispatched to Dust Creek for the doctor, a weary, circuit-riding physician named Elias Matthews, who arrived an hour later in a dusty buggy. He worked in the master bedroom of the ranch house, a room that now smelled of antiseptic and fear. Abigail waited outside, pacing the long hallway, her blood-stained dress a stark reminder of the morning's horror. Helen, the foreman's wife, had tried to make her change, but Abigail had refused, unable to move, unable to think of anything but the man whose life hung in the balance just a few feet away. When Dr. Matthews finally emerged, his face was grave. He removed his spectacles and polished them with a tired sigh. "The bullet passed through," he said, his voice low, cleanly. "Thank God. But he has lost a great deal of blood. The wound is deep, and the ride back, it did him no favors. Now there is a fever, a bad one." He looked at Abigail, his eyes holding a tired kindness. "He is a strong man, but this will be a hard fight. Keep him cool. Try to get some broth into him if he wakes. The rest is in God's hands." And so the long vigil began. The days bled into one another, a seamless blur of hot sun and long, terrifying nights. Abigail did not leave his side. She was a ghost in the sick room, moving with a silent, tireless grace. She bathed his feverish forehead with cool water, changed the dressings on his wound with hands that did not tremble, and sat by his bedside, watching the shallow, labored rise and fall of his chest. She talked to him, her voice a low, constant murmur, telling him about the ranch, about Tommy, about the horses. She spoke of the future as if it were a certainty, a place they were both walking toward. Even as she watched him slip further away. On the third day, a strange thing happened. A wagon appeared on the road leading to the ranch, then another. They were not filled with gawkers or gossips, but with men from Dust Creek. The blacksmith was there, and the general store owner, and farmers from the surrounding homesteads. They brought lumber and tools. They brought food. Without a word, they began to work. They started clearing the charred debris of the burned barn, their movements slow and respectful, the sounds of their labor a quiet, steady rhythm of atonement. Cole's stand in the town hall, his near sacrifice for the woman and child he had claimed, had shamed them into a kind of decency they had not known they possessed. They had come to rebuild what their hatred had helped to destroy. The women of the town came too, bringing casseroles and fresh bread, leaving them on the porch of the main house with quiet nods and averted eyes. On the fifth day, as Abigail was changing Cole's bandages, another visitor arrived. Helen came to the door of the bedroom and whispered that she had a guest. Abigail turned to see her sister, Martha, standing in the hallway. She looked small and lost in the large, masculine house, her face pale, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. Abigail stepped out into the hall, closing the door softly behind her. The two sisters stood in silence for a long moment, a chasm of years and pain between them. It was Martha who finally broke. A dry, ragged sob escaped her lips. "Abby," she whispered, the name a rusty key in a long, unused lock. "I am so sorry. What I said, in the town hall, it was a wicked thing, a wicked, cowardly thing." Her confession was a torrent of shame. She spoke of her fear, of her desperate need to be accepted, to be seen as normal. She spoke of the shame that had been her constant companion since the fire, a shame she had projected onto Abigail, the living symbol of her own survival. I was the one who was twisted. Martha wept, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. "Not you. You were always the strong one. You saved my life, and I repaid you with cruelty." Abigail listened, her expression unreadable. She felt no anger. The capacity for that kind of pain had been burned out of her in the canyon, replaced by the cold, immediate terror of losing Cole. All she felt was a great, weary sadness for this woman who was her sister, for the years they had lost to fear. She reached out and placed a hand on Martha's arm. "It is in the past, Martha," she said, her voice quiet. "We cannot change it. It was not a full absolution, not the warm embrace of a fairy tale reconciliation. It was something quieter, and perhaps more real. It was an acknowledgement of the truth, and a quiet closing of a very painful door." Martha left soon after, her shoulders a little less stooped, a small measure of her burden lifted. Cole's fever finally broke on the 7th night. Abigail was dozing in her chair when a sound from the bed startled her awake. His eyes were open. They were clear. He was looking at her. "Abby," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. A wave of relief so powerful it left her dizzy washed over her. She was at his side in an instant, a spoonful of cool water at his lips. He was weak, terribly weak, but he was alive. He was back. His recovery was a slow, arduous process. The wound in his side healed, but it left him changed. The deep muscle damage meant that when he finally took his first steps, He walked with a pronounced limp. For a man who had moved through the world with such physical power and confidence, it was a devastating blow. A new kind of vulnerability settled over him. He became quiet, withdrawn, his frustration a constant, simmering anger just below the surface. He felt broken, a cripple. One afternoon, he was standing on the porch, leaning heavily on a cane, watching his men work on the frame of the new barn. Abigail came to stand beside him. She saw the bitter line of his mouth, the shame in his eyes as he watched his men move with an ease he no longer possessed. "It is a fine thing they are doing," she said softly, gesturing to the rising structure. "I am useless," he said, his voice flat. "Half a man." She was silent for a moment. Then she moved to stand in front of him, forcing him to look at her. She gently touched her own face, her fingers tracing the familiar, ruined landscape of her skin. "When I was a girl," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I used to hate this. I thought it was a curse that made me ugly, a punishment. I spent years hiding from it, and from the world." She looked directly into his eyes, and he saw in them not a reflection of her own pain, but a profound and gentle wisdom. "But I was wrong," she continued. "This is not a curse. It is a map. It is the story of how I survived. It is the story of how I saved my sister." She reached out and laid her hand on his leg, where the muscles had been torn. "You have a new mark now. It is not a sign of weakness. Cole, it tells the story of how you rode into a storm to save a woman and a boy. It is the story of how you fought for us. Every scar tells a story, and yours is a story of courage." He stared at her, his throat tight with an emotion he could not name. She had taken his shame and transformed it into a badge of honor. She had given him her own hard-won wisdom as a gift. He reached out and pulled her to him, burying his face in her hair, his shoulders shaking with the release of a tension he had not even realized he was carrying. From that day on, he began to heal, not just in body, but in spirit. He walked with a limp, but he no longer walked with shame. The new barn rose from the ashes, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the surprising kindness of a community. Cole and Abigail worked on it together, hammering boards side by side, their shared labor a silent promise. When the circuit judge came through Dust Creek a month later, Cole and Abigail stood before him, with Tommy between them. The adoption was a simple, legal procedure, but the quiet words of the judge made them a family in the eyes of the law, formalizing the bond that had already been forged in fire and love. The following Sunday, for the first time, the three of them went to church together. As Cole, Abigail, and Tommy walked down the aisle, a profound silence fell over the congregation. Cole walked slowly, his limp noticeable, but his head was held high. Abigail was at his side, her scarred face serene, her hand resting in the crook of his arm. Tommy walked between them, holding both their hands. No one whispered, no one sneered. Those who had been the loudest in their mockery now looked down at their own hands, their faces flushed with a quiet shame. As they took their place in the front pew, the one that had always been reserved for the Travers family, the pastor, Reverend Miller, looked out at them, and for the first time, his eyes held not judgment, but a grudging, silent respect. A fragile, hopeful light had begun to spread across the sun-scorched plains, a light that promised not to erase the scars of the past, but to illuminate the beauty of their survival. They chose to be married not in the cold stone church that had once cast her out, but under the vast, open cathedral of the Texas sky. It was a late afternoon in autumn, when the fierce heat of summer had softened into a gentle, golden warmth. Their chapel was a wide, flat meadow on a rise of land overlooking the T-Cross, the prairie grasses rippling like a tawny sea in the breeze. There was no organ music, only the whisper of the wind through the grama grass and the distant, contented lowing of cattle, a sound that was, for them, a far more sacred hymn. The congregation was a small, eclectic gathering, a testament to the world they had remade from the ashes of the old one. Cole's ranch hands were there, their hats held respectfully in their hands, their faces scrubbed clean, their usual boisterous energy subdued into a quiet, watchful respect. Ben and Helen, the foreman and his wife, stood at the front, their faces beaming with a parental pride. And from the town, a small delegation had come, the blacksmith, the store owner and his wife, a few of the ranchers who had come to help rebuild the barn. Even Martha was there, standing hesitantly at the back with her husband, the sheriff. She did not push herself forward, but her presence was a quiet, necessary act of penance and of peace. Cole stood waiting, leaning lightly on his cane. The limp was a part of him now, a permanent reminder of the price of his new life. But there was no shame in his posture. He wore a simple, dark suit, his gaze fixed on the path that led from the ranch house. His eyes, once so stormy and guarded, were clear and bright with an unwavering focus. He was a man who had finally found his true north. Then she came. Abigail walked alone, her steps steady and sure on the familiar earth. She wore a dress of simple white cotton, unadorned with a lace or frills, a dress Helen had helped her sew. It was the color of a clean, new beginning. Her dark hair was simply pinned up, and on her face, she wore nothing, no veil, no shadow. She met the gaze of the small crowd without flinching, her scars catching the golden afternoon light. They were not a mark of ruin, but the emblem of a queen who had won her crown through fire and trial. She was not a monster to be hidden or an object of pity to be tolerated. She was Abigail Travers, and she was walking toward her husband. She stopped in front of Cole, and he took her hand, his calloused palm warm and strong around hers. He did not need the cane to stand tall now. He drew his strength from her. They turned to face Reverend Miller, who had made the journey from town at Cole's request. The pastor looked older, humbled by the events of the past months. The rigid piety in his eyes had been replaced by a weary, hard-won understanding. He began the simple, traditional service, his voice carrying on the prairie wind. He spoke of hardship and redemption, of finding grace in unexpected places. When it came time for the vows, he looked at Cole. "Do you, Cole Travers, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live?" Cole never took his eyes off Abigail. A slow smile touched his lips, a smile of such profound and certain love that it made the air around them hum. "I do," he said, his voice deep and clear. Then he added, his words meant not for the pastor, but for the world, for everyone who had ever judged them. "I choose her. I choose her not because she is beautiful, but because she is real." A soft murmur went through the small crowd. It was not a sound of shock, but of deep, resonant understanding. It was the truest thing anyone had ever said in that meadow. Helen, the foreman's wife, let out a small sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. The blacksmith cleared his throat, his eyes suddenly misty. They were not just witnessing a wedding. They were witnessing a truth, a testament to a love that had been forged in the harshest of fires. When the pastor asked Abigail, her voice was a soft but unwavering echo of Cole's own certainty. "I do." They exchanged simple, unadorned gold bands. As Cole slid the ring onto her finger, he saw that her hand was not trembling. This was not a dream she was afraid of waking from. This was a reality she had fought for, that she had earned. "Then, by the power vested in me," Reverend Miller declared, a genuine warmth finally entering his voice, "I now pronounce you man and wife." Before he could even say the words, "You may kiss the bride," Cole leaned in and kissed her. It was a kiss of profound peace, a quiet, certain sealing of a promise that had already been made in their hearts. Suddenly, a shower of dried prairie flowers, petals of purple and yellow, rained down around them. Tommy, who had been standing quietly at Ben's side, was now running in circles around them. laughing with pure delight as he tossed the contents of his small basket into the air. That joyous, childish sound broke the spell of reverence, and the crowd erupted in a cheer that rolled across the plains. The ranch hands whooped and threw their hats into the air. The townsfolk clapped and smiled. It was a celebration not just for the couple, but for the community that had found its own soul again. As the small gathering began to celebrate, a lone wagon, driven by the sheriff, could be seen on the road leading away from Dust Creek, heading south. In the back, sitting ramrod straight, was Lydia Vane. She was on her way to the territorial court to stand trial for arson and attempted murder. Her reign of bitter vengeance was over. Her story, now just a footnote in the larger, more powerful tale of the lives she had failed to destroy. The party was a simple one, with food laid out on long tables and a fiddler who had come from town playing cheerful tunes. But as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and crimson, Cole touched Abigail's arm. Without a word, they slipped away from the small crowd and walked to the edge of the rise, to a place where they could look out over the vast, darkening land that was their home. The light was magical, a river of liquid gold that poured over the world, making everything it touched beautiful. It bathed the new, unpainted wood of the rising barn in a warm glow. It illuminated the faces of their friends and family, their laughter carrying on the evening air, and it fell upon Abigail's face, tracing the network of her scars not with a harsh, revealing glare, but with a soft, gilded light. The fire had once marked her for ruin. The sunset now anointed her with gold. Cole reached out and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking the very scar he had first touched in the cave so long ago. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. He leaned down and kissed her again, a long, slow kiss under the dying sun. A kiss that held all the promises of the quiet, peaceful nights and busy, shared days to come. When they parted, she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. "I never thought I deserved this," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion too deep for tears. "A life this full." He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, his chin resting on the top of her head. He breathed in the scent of her hair, of clean cotton and prairie air. He felt the solid, real warmth of her in his arms, the anchor that had saved him from drifting away into his own sea of grief. "You always deserved it." "Abby," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble against her ear. "You always deserved it. I just had not gotten around to telling you yet." They stood there for a long time, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear, leaving the sky to the stars. The happiness that enveloped them was not a fragile, fairy tale thing. It was a fortress, built of courage and kindness, its foundation sunk deep into the hard, unforgiving, and beautiful red earth of the land they called home. It was real, and it was theirs. The seasons turned, and the years, which had once seemed so cruel and unforgiving, settled upon the high plains with a gentle, patient hand. The raw, desperate settlement of Dust Creek slowly shed its skin of dust and desperation. The clapboard shacks gave way to sturdy brick buildings. Trees were planted along the main street, and the sound of a schoolhouse bell replaced the once constant threat of a gunshot. The town grew, but it grew around the heart of the T-Cross Ranch, which had become more than just a place of business. It was a landmark, a symbol of endurance, a place of legend. And at the center of that legend were Cole and Abigail Travers. The story of their love became a part of the town's very soul, a piece of local folklore told on quiet evenings. Newcomers would hear it from the old-timers in the general store or the blacksmith's shop. It was the story of the woman with the scarred face and the most beautiful heart, and the cattle baron who had the wisdom to see it. It became a cautionary tale against snap judgments and a testament to a love that had proven as tough and as enduring as the landscape itself. The name Scarred Abbey, once a stone of cruelty, was forgotten, buried under the weight of a new and better story. Their lives did not become a quiet idle. They built upon the foundations of their hard-won peace, turning their own experiences of pain and salvation outward. The T-Cross Ranch became a sanctuary. Abigail, who had known the profound loneliness of being an outcast child, could not turn away another. Over the years, the ranch became a home for a handful of other lost children, orphans of the harsh frontier who had nowhere else to turn. She never sought them out, but like Tommy, they seemed to find their way to her. She taught them all to ride, not just with skill, but with the quiet confidence she knew was the best armor against a cruel world. The sound of children's laughter became a common music at the ranch, a sound that healed the last of the old, silent wounds in Cole's own heart. Tommy grew into a fine young man, strong and kind, with his mother's quiet empathy and his father's steady resolve. He became the foreman of the T-Cross, his love for the land and the family that had saved him absolute and unwavering. Cole found a new voice, not in the public square, but on the quiet pages of a leather-bound journal. The man who had once been a creature of terse commands and long silences began to write. He filled page after page with the story of his life, not just the tally of cattle and the price of land, but the inner workings of his soul. He wrote of Eleanor, his first wife, with a gentle, honest sorrow, finally making peace with the ghost of his own guilt. He wrote of his love for Abigail, trying to capture in clumsy ink the sheer, overwhelming force of what she meant to him. He wrote of loss and redemption, of the nature of courage, and of the surprising ways a man's heart can be broken and then rebuilt, stronger than before. It was a private legacy, a testament for his son, and for himself, that his life had not been measured in acres or dollars, but in the depth of his love. They never left. Their roots had grown too deep into the red soil to ever be transplanted. This land, which had been the backdrop for so much of their pain, had also been the crucible in which their happiness was forged. It was a part of them, its vast, empty spaces a reflection of the solitude they had once known, and its surprising, tenacious life a mirror of their own survival. They belonged to it, and it to them. Decades passed. The world changed. The railroad came through, bringing with it new people and new ideas that sanded the rough edges off the old frontier. But on the porch of the T-Cross Ranch house, time seemed to move at its own, slower pace. One evening, in the twilight of their lives, they sat together in their accustomed chairs, watching the sun make its slow, majestic descent. They were old now. Cole's hair was a shock of silver, and the lines on his face were a deep and intricate map of his long life. He leaned more heavily on his cane, but his eyes, when he looked at his wife, were as bright and clear as they had been on their wedding day. Abigail's hair was also silver, braided and coiled in a simple crown. The years had softened the angry tautness of her scars, blending them into the gentle, wrinkled landscape of her face. They were no longer a disfigurement. They were simply a part of her, like the color of her eyes or the sound of her voice. They sat in a comfortable, familiar silence, the kind that exists only between two people who know each other's souls completely. The wind, a constant companion throughout their lives, sighed through the dry autumn grass, carrying the sweet, clean scent of cured hay and the distant, musical clanking of cowbells as the herd settled for the night. It was the same sound, the same scent, the same peaceful lullaby of the West that had blessed their wedding day. Cole reached out and took her hand. It was a gesture he had made 1,000 times, but it had never lost its meaning. Her hand, gnarled now with age but still so familiar, rested in his. He brought it to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. He looked at her, his love for her a quiet, steady flame that had warmed him for a lifetime. He saw not the old woman beside him, but every woman she had ever been, the resilient, lonely girl in the stables, the fierce protector in the canyon, the beautiful bride in the meadow. They were all there, held in the serene peace of her aged face. "You know," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, weathered by time. "I have been thinking." He paused, a small, gentle smile playing on his lips. After all these years? After all this time? He turned his gaze from her to the spectacular death of the day, the sky a blaze of crimson and gold. Then he looked back at her, his eyes holding the unwavering truth of his entire life. You are still the greatest treasure I have ever known. A slow, peaceful smile bloomed on Abigail's face. It was a smile of pure contentment, a reflection of a life lived without regret. She did not need to say anything. Her hands simply tightened in his. She leaned her head back against the old, weathered wood of her rocking chair and closed her eyes. Listening, she heard the wind and the cattle and the steady, beloved breathing of the man beside her. She heard the music of her life, a lullaby of the West, a song of survival and of a love that was as light as road dust and as enduring as desert rock. The last rays of the setting sun broke through the clouds, a final, brilliant flare of light. It washed over the porch and over her face, catching in the intricate web of her old scars. For a brief, breathtaking moment, they were no longer the pale, silvery marks of a long-ago fire. They shone, luminous and bright, as if they were etched in pure, spun gold. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.